This is Philosophy Bites with me, David Edmonds.
And me, Nigel Warburton.
Philosophy Bites is available at www.philosophybites.com. Anglo-American philosophy exhibits its disdain for Indian philosophy by more or less ignoring it. But that, says Keith Ward, author of numerous books including Concepts of God, is a big mistake. Take idealism, a theory that the ultimate nature of reality is non-physical. There's a parallel tradition of idealism in both East and West, and according to Professor Ward, each could learn from the other.
Keith Ward, welcome to Philosophy Bites.
Hi.
We're going to focus on idealism, East and West. So what is idealism?
Well, I suppose idealism is the view that the fundamental reality is spiritual, not material. So it contrasts with materialism. And if you're a materialist, you say, well, ultimately everything's made up of little material bits probably and laws governing their interaction. So it's all material. Idealism is the opposite of that. So it's not all material. In fact, matter is an expression or appearance of something which is not material. You could say spiritual or mental or conscious, probably. So an idealist would think that ultimately this universe is an expression or manifestation of a conscious or mental reality.
So this is very much in the philosophical tradition of the distinction between appearance and reality, because most of us think we're moving in a material world. And in the idealist tradition, idealists believe that what appears to be just a material world has something beyond it, a deeper reality which is not material.
That's exactly right. I suppose this decision goes back to Plato, doesn't it, really? And you think you're in the real world of touches and sights and sounds and so on. But actually, these are appearances of a deeper reality. And some things in modern physics suggest that that might be true as well. So you say, well, we're really in a 11-dimensional curved space-time, and it doesn't feel like that. And an idealist would agree with that, but say, actually, the reality which is beneath the appearances is mental or conscious in its nature.
And in Eastern philosophy, there's a great tradition of this kind of idealism.
Yes, there is. In fact, I think it's true of most Indian schools of philosophy that they'd make a big distinction between matter and spirit. I'm using English words for that, obviously. But there's distinction between matter and spirit has a greater reality than matter. There are lots of different Indian schools, but the idealist schools, which are usually called Vedantic schools, are idealist, basically. And they say that Brahman, that's you could translate as the absolute reality, has the nature of being, consciousness, and bliss. Sat, Chit, Ananda, being, consciousness, and bliss. And that everything is part of that one underlying reality. That's the Vedantic school of philosophy, which is one of the 6 major Indian schools of philosophy.
So that one combines idealism with a kind of monism, that everything is ultimately one underneath the world of appearances.
That's right. An idealist doesn't have to be a monist. You could think there are lots of different minds, and the English philosopher MacTaggart did used to believe that, lots of different minds. And Jains, the religious group, believe that. But in the Vedantic tradition, which is probably the best known Indian tradition, it's monistic as well. And they would use a text from the Upanishads that all is Brahman, everything is one. So we're all parts of this absolute reality.
So what follows from that in the Vedantic tradition? How should we live? How should we interact with the material world?
Well, there are different interpretations, as always, but one interpretation would be that you and I aren't really different beings, so we're not alien to each other. We're actually literally part of the same united reality. So the claim would be, if you see that, to see that properly, you'd have to be enlightened, and if you were enlightened and you saw that we're all parts of one reality, then that would overcome opposition and conflict and violence, because you'd think nothing is mine, nothing belongs to me, because I am just part of the whole. So there is an ethical implication of this for most Vedantins. I suppose the view would be that our individual selves are illusory in some sense. They're like the skins of an onion. You peel them away, your personality, your traits, the different dispositions you have. You take those away and you find that your true self, which is called Atman, the true inner self, is actually the same in everyone. We actually literally aren't different in some sense. It's an illusion. It's due to ignorance that we think we're different. So when you see that you are not an individual self which can possess something, but you're actually identical in your innermost reality with everyone else and with everything else, then possessiveness becomes a logical absurdity. That's the claim of one of the greatest Vedantin philosophers, the best known in the West, probably Shankara, who is probably 8th century AD.
And was he a Buddhist philosopher?
That is a very good question. Absolutely not. But yes, by that I mean his philosophy was invented in order to get rid of Buddhism from India, which he successfully did. But he did it by taking over all the Buddhist insights. This is a very naughty thing to say, but I think most scholars would agree that what Shankara did was use all the Buddhist insights, incorporate them into Hinduism, and say, oh, we don't need Buddhism anymore because we've got it all. So he's a crypto-Buddhist, but he would definitely say, I'm absolutely not a Buddhist.
Now, to be a bit sceptical here, I mean, why would anybody believe this? What's the evidence?
That is not a question that would have arisen for Shankara or for the other best-known Vedantin philosopher, Ramanuja. They believed it on scriptural authority. I mean, you have to say, if you're looking at classical Indian philosophy in the early medieval period, they just accept the Upanishads and the Veda as revealed, divinely given truth, given by the gods or supernatural beings. So Shankara just said, I believe this because it's in the scriptures. Now, things have changed, interestingly. So if you go to India today and you look at Vedantin philosophers, they will say the evidence is the experience of liberation. So you know that it's true because you meditate, you break through the boundaries of self and egoism, and you actually experience unity with the all. That stress on experience, ironically, comes from the German philosophical tradition, which has been imported into India since the 19th century and has given rise to what's now called Neo-Vedanta. And Neo-Vedanta doesn't say, we believe this just because it's in scripture. Neo-Vedantins would say, we believe this because somebody, perhaps me, but perhaps some guru that I follow, has experienced liberation and experienced this unity with the all. So now it's experience. That's not true for the classical tradition.
Obviously, within the Western philosophical tradition, idealism is associated with German 18th and 19th century philosophy. I wonder if there's any causal influence there with the Indian idealism coming through the German philosophy.
Yeah, again, many PhDs have been written on this subject, and I think my own view would be that there wasn't a close textual influence. It wasn't that people like Hegel in Germany had read carefully all the Indian philosophers. They didn't really have the languages, and they didn't have access to the scripts as we now do, thanks to the internet and so on. So they didn't have the knowledge, but they got some big ideas, I think, from India. And Hegel's big idea can be centered on his definition of infinity. Classically, Christian philosophers in the West had said that God is infinite, and the infinite is completely opposed to the finite, and therefore God, the infinite, and the finite universe have nothing in common. They're completely different. The infinite excludes the finite by definition. What Hegel did was to say, no, actually infinite means nothing is outside it. If it's infinite, it excludes nothing. Therefore, by definition, but a different definition, everything must be part of the infinite. And that was the big move Hegel made to a monistic and spiritual view he called the ultimate reality, Geist, or absolute spirit. Now, this actually originated by thinking about what was meant by the notion of infinity, which was becoming a subject of inquiry in mathematics as well at that time. So that wasn't influenced by the Indian traditions, but Hegel had read the available texts, the Upanishads and so on, and he could see a sort of similarity. So there was a general influence, but it wasn't technically informed, and Hegel, I'm sorry to say, didn't think much of Indian religious thought.
But Schopenhauer was more explicitly indebted to Indian thought, I believe.
He certainly was. But again, he didn't really know the text in any detail. I mean, he knew what had been translated of the Upanishads. And of course, they are actually philosophical documents. I mean, if you read the Bible, it's not philosophical. You'd find it very difficult to find philosophical arguments. But in the Upanishads, you do find a concentration on the nature of the reality, the nature of the self, and the argument that the true self is identical with the supreme reality. So they are philosophical sorts of texts. And Schopenhauer was very influenced by that. And one reason it was used, of course, by Schopenhauer in particular, was because he didn't like the very anthropomorphic views of God with which he was familiar in German Lutheranism. He thought you've got to get away from that, thinking God is a person who arbitrarily sends people to hell or not. And so I think he found in the Indian traditions a very different approach, which is still a spiritual approach. I mean, Schopenhauer, although he was called the first great German atheist, wasn't really an atheist at all. He just didn't like God. He didn't like the word God, but he thought that the nature of reality was spiritual. He was an idealist, in other words. And I think, yes, he was very influenced by Indian modes of thought.
In Anglo-American philosophy, idealism flourished at the end of the 19th century. But now, most contemporary British and American philosophers look on that as a phase that we've moved beyond. Is that a fair assessment, would you say?
I think that's a fair assessment of the actual situation, but there are a few of us left. And I think we're a growing band. There'll be 4 by next year. Idealism is not fashionable. That's very true. One reason for that is the great success of science, which focuses on explaining human mental elements of consciousness in neurophysiological terms. That's had a great influence towards materialism. That's quite true. But I think most of the main arguments for idealism are still in place, and you find them mostly in some quantum physicists, people like Roger Penrose, who might say, well, maybe consciousness is fundamental to reality in some sense. And you get people saying they are Platonists. So there are a few. But the big question still remains, isn't it true that consciousness may have an ineliminable place in our ontology? You can't get rid of it. And then the question is, well, does it just emerge from matter? If it's different from matter, does it just emerge? Or maybe could matter be seen as something which only exists when consciousness exists? And that's a view I would hold myself. I obviously need a long time to convince anybody if I ever could. But idealism is still around in that form, that all the things we see and touch and feel are actually elements of consciousness.
And in your own philosophical development, have you felt that you've learnt from your studies of Indian philosophy things that you couldn't have learnt from the study of Western philosophy?
Well, I think the Indian philosophical traditions are very interesting. They begin from a different place than the Western tradition. When the Western tradition begins from thinking that a supreme consciousness would be a creator who is different from the creation and who created for some reason to get something done of some sort. Whereas the Indian traditions don't start there. They start from asking, what is the nature of this reality that we're in? And they say, in the Vedantic tradition, well, its nature is pure spirit. So you're not talking about another reality. You're talking about the true inner nature of this reality. Though there's no reason why Indian idealists shouldn't talk about God. They usually do say God is a sort of picture image of absolute consciousness. But you mustn't think of God as another person. That would be quite wrong. So I think it's a philosophically deep view. I mean, you're asking questions about the nature of consciousness. And is consciousness necessarily something that has to be embodied in a human brain and body? And my own view is the answer that is no, not necessarily. I don't think that I can see any necessity in that. And then if you explore the hypothesis, well, what if it wasn't? What if there were a consciousness which wasn't at all embodied and which could have something like thoughts, intelligence? Then would it be possible that this material universe was an expression of that? Perhaps I should say that in the Indian tradition there are 2 ways of taking this, which you might call a negative way and a positive way. The negative way is you say the whole of our empirical reality is an illusion. People use the word maya. An illusion is something that is simply false. It's like a mirage in the desert. And you say, well, it's not there. And once you see through it, you see that the reality is just the one unified consciousness. That's the negative view. But there's a positive view, which is more associated with Ramanuja rather than Shankara. Ramanuja was 12th century, came after Shankara. And he held that it's not an illusion. The model that Ramanuja used was the world, the universe, is the body of the Lord. So the idea of the universe as God's body actually goes back to 12th century Indian philosophy. And saying that the world is the body of God has a positive impact, that maybe it's an expression of some of the potentialities within the divine consciousness which have to be expressed. And there you sound very much like Hegel, if you're getting into that the whole of history is the progressive self-revelation of the absolute. Where Hegel introduced something new was the idea of evolution or development, that the history is a progressive revelation of the absolute. And this passed back into more recent Indian thought, which is able to accept an evolutionary view in the sense of a progressive revelation, bit by bit, of what absolute reality is like.
Given the richness of the philosophical tradition in Indian thought that you've described, why do you think it's been so marginalised in Western philosophy departments?
Well, the language is difficult. I mean, you've got to have Sanskrit, really, and Sanskrit is a very difficult language to learn. And it's partly because the Indian traditions are classically, scripturally based on a very different scripture, the Upanishads, from anything in the West. Western philosophers have tended to say, this is not philosophy, this is just taking for revealed knowledge. But actually, it could be quite an interesting sort of philosophy because you take your premises from somewhere and then you say, where do we go from there? And that's a very interesting thing to do. But that's why it's been neglected. And so it's a pity, but it's a rather neglected field in Britain. But maybe it'll all change.
Keith Ward, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And you can hear more Philosophy Bites at www.philosophybites.com.